Hey everyone, again this is Delta Penguin from Peng Tech, name pending and or maybe swappable in the future. Whoops. And let's see. Now the question is, what is SQL? And let me think. I guess part of this topic is we're also going to talk about infrastructure a little bit and infrastructure and how apps are what do you say, how apps are created and divided typically, how they're structured. So as an example, a lot of programming code back in the day, and even some nowadays, but the old style of doing it was to create something called monolithic applications. I gotta change this title. Front End versus Backend. Give me a sec. Okay. And what that was is basically you have a company and maybe they're in business for several years, and so they create, their program starts small and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and just becomes this monolithic, ginormous kind of thing. Which, it's like, okay, it has a lot of features now, which is good and hopefully steady, stable. But the problem with something like that is that whenever you need to change something, there's a chance you broke something else. And while that's true of other code as well, the larger the program is, the more you have to test it, right? Whenever a change is made, and there's more stuff to test as well. And so it's like harder, like diminishing returns, harder to do. But then also it's harder to reuse the code as well, right? We talked about that's one of the factors of good code is that you don't repeat yourself and you're able to create reusable components like functions or classes, which I didn't really talk about, but stuff like that is the goal of what you should be aiming for when you're programming. So monolithic makes it harder to do that. It makes you slower to adapt and other stuff like that. But a different style architecture is like the microservices architecture. And what that is like it starts breaks up the components it breaks things up into more smaller components. And a good factor of programming is something called separation of concerns. What that means you try to isolate different functionality and keep it separate so that, say, you could have multiple teams working on the different parts, and if one thing breaks, the other parts should still work if it's properly loosely coupled, which just means, hey, if it's not, not like monolithic, it's not directly tied together, then it's easier to, adjust something and not break something else. Yeah, in essence. Okay. So part of the main separations come along with something called the front end versus the back end. The front end is like the user interface, the UI or the GUI, the graphical user interface. That's what you see when you're what you typically see when you're like running Windows or Mac or something like that. The file system, all the common system functions that you have. That's part of the OS. And that code is also what runs like the standard executable files and programs on the computer. Executables for Windows and something else for Mac and Linux. But yeah, so the front end is what the user interacts with. So it could be like the website, it could be like the phone app, And then the back end is like the storage of the data. So once you interact with Facebook and you type out a blog post, then where does the data go to be saved so that you can view it later? And that's the back end. The back end sends that data to a server, typically a SQL server, and it will go and store that data for you, so that it can be recalled later, used later, analyzed, and whatever else. So a lot of the processing in the background, or if it's on another server, which is just a computer that's not yours, basically just some other computer that does like the heavy lifting, the processing. That's kind of like what a server is. The internet is basically just computers, a bunch of computers and devices all connected to each other in some fashion and able to access each other and send each other information. So that's the long and short of what the internet or the cloud is. It's just that intertangled web of the World Wide Web, all those different connections together. So the GUI or the front end side of things focuses on making things look pretty, and making things look pretty, and then deciding where to put the buttons, how big should they be, how they look, how when you hover over something you should change the color so to give the user feedback, so that they know that you can interact with it. And then the back end's more, again, the processing and the data storage. And so I mentioned SQL is the main way that a lot of that data gets stored, and we'll talk about that in the next video.